Well, tonight we're going to completely wrap up our study of the book of Acts. Last week we looked at Acts chapter 28. We finished the book, but the book left us with some unanswered questions that we're going to try to tackle tonight. Just to let you know that next Wednesday we're going to begin a brand new study. It'll be in the New Testament book of Hebrews. I'm going to introduce you to the book of Hebrews next week. Then the following week will be a business meeting, so that will take the place of Bible study that night. And then following the business meeting, we will start with Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, and make our way through that book. But as we concluded Acts last week, we were left with more questions than answers. Luke took us through all of Paul's trials in chapters 22 through 26, and time again, the verdict seemed to have been he's not guilty, but he was not released. Eventually, Paul appeals his case to Caesar, which means he has to go to Rome, and what a sea adventure he was on. Experiencing 14 days of a horrible storm, shipwreck, but he makes it finally to Rome safely. And in chapter 28, we are expecting Luke to give us the answer to the question, what happens at the trial? But Luke never mentions the trial. He just kind of skips that part and lets it go. But we want to know what happened to Paul. We are curious people, and we understand that Luke's agenda was about the gospel, not necessarily about Paul, but we still have those questions. If Luke wrote his book somewhere between AD 70 and 80, and this trial took place in AD 62, Luke knows the verdict. He knows what happened to Paul. And we would like to know that too. So Luke knows the people that Luke wrote to originally, they probably knew as well. But here we are over 1900 years later, and we have some questions. And one of those questions happens to be, what happens to Paul after Acts chapter 28? And tonight we're going to look at a number of questions and try to answer them, both from what the Bible says and also what church history has to say about those topics. And the first question is, what happens at Paul's trial before Caesar? I mean, we were ready for that trial. And for some reason, Luke decides not to record it, and we're looking for Acts chapter 29, where we actually have the story of the trial, but it's not there. There are three possible outcomes to this trial. One possible outcome is Paul never stands trial. And there was a theory that circulated among scholars for a while that there was about an 18-month statutory claim on cases. In other words, if you had a case and you were the prosecutor, you had 18 months in which to prosecute that case. And if after 18 months you never show up to prosecute the case, the theory is that the prisoner goes free. You didn't prosecute him, they throw the case out of court, and the prisoner goes free. And in many ways that helps explain the fact that in Luke chapter 28 verse 30, Paul mentions the fact that Paul's in Rome for 2 years. He's under house arrest for 2 years. So the theory is those 18 months came and went. There was some additional paperwork and legal procedures that had to be filed, and eventually Paul was set free because the Jewish people never showed up to prosecute the case. And there was good reason for that, because by 62 AD, the leaders in Jerusalem had other issues. There was a lot of unrest in the nation of Israel. There were many in the nation of Israel who wanted Rome out of their country. So there was a lot of unrest, and maybe by then they had basically forgotten about Paul. Paul was out of their country. Paul was many, many miles away, and they just didn't care anymore. The problem with this theory is it's actually a misreading of an edict given by an emperor from the 3rd century. In other words, about 200 years after Paul's case. So it's also true that the edict by the emperor involved a civil case, not a criminal case. And there's no evidence in Roman law that if the prosecution doesn't show up to try the case, that the prisoner goes free. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. So this was an opportunity to try to explain the evidence, but in the end, the theory really doesn't hold much water. It was required by the prosecution to show up and try the case. If the prosecution doesn't show up, they could get in a lot of trouble, they could be fined, and so chances are the Jewish prosecutors did eventually make their way to Rome to try this case. There's a second possibility, and that's the fact that Paul is found guilty and he's executed. And the reasoning is Luke didn't want to write that down. We're going to find out tonight that Luke and Paul were very good friends. And it would have been very painful for Luke to record the execution of his very close friend. And so Luke simply leaves it out. Also, it doesn't really fit Luke's purpose to record the execution. But the problem with this theory is, if Luke knew all along that Paul was executed at this time in AD 62, then why is he so favorably disposed toward the Roman officials? Time and time again in the book of Acts, the Roman officials come off in a very positive light. Why would Luke portray them that way if at the end they executed Paul on such flimsy evidence? And so many scholars reject that theory because it really doesn't fit what Luke had to say all along about the Romans. The third possibility is that Paul is found innocent and he's set free. Now in Acts chapter 23, verse 11, and chapter 27, verse 24, God basically says to Paul, you will stand trial before Caesar. When Paul is lost at sea and everybody thinks they're going to die, that's when the angel says to Paul, you're going to Rome and you will stand trial. So if we take those statements literally, it means that Paul did go to trial. And it also means that based on the evidence, it looks like Paul was released. There's some evidence in what we call the pastoral letters. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are called the pastoral epistles, the pastoral letters. There's some information that Paul gives us in those letters that doesn't fit his life up to this point. In other words, the only logical explanation for what Paul writes in those 3 letters is that it had to have taken place after his release from Rome. It's very difficult to fit that information into the book of Acts and what we already know about Paul. There's also a statement written by Eusebius. Eusebius lived in Caesarea, and he makes this statement about 325 AD. And he's talking about Paul. He says, after defending himself successfully, it is currently reported that the apostle, Paul, went forth to proclaim the gospel, and afterwards came to Rome a second time, and was martyred under Nero. So according to Eusebius, who writes basically in ancient church history, according to his records, Paul got released the first time. He defended himself successfully. He was released. But when he comes to Rome a second time, that's when he gets martyred. And so because of that statement, many believe that Paul was indeed released, declared not guilty, innocent at this trial. The trial takes place in about AD 62. And the timing of this trial was very favorable to Paul. At this time, Nero is about 25 years old, and he's still taking advice from his childhood tutor named Seneca. Seneca was a philosopher, a very smart man, a very logical man, and this time he's probably giving advice to Nero. Seneca has a brother named Gallio. We read about him in Acts chapter 18. Gallio was the proconsul or the governor at Corinth. There were charges brought against Paul and the other missionaries in Corinth. And Gallio decided that Paul was so innocent that he didn't even want to hear the case. He just simply threw the case out of court and told Paul and the missionaries that it was fine with him if they spread their religion throughout Corinth. Well, if Seneca and Gallio talked, and apparently they did from time to time, it's quite possible that Seneca recommended to Nero that he simply declare Paul innocent and let him go. So chances are, and most of the evidence points to the fact, that Paul was released after that first imprisonment. Which leads us to this question. Why doesn't Luke mention the outcome of Paul's trial, especially since he was released? It would have been a fitting conclusion to the book to say that Paul was declared not guilty and the gospel spread. Here's a thought. This is AD 62, and Paul is declared innocent. Paul will get arrested again in about AD 66 to 68. And the second time he gets arrested, he's executed. He's martyred for his faith. And the emperor in both cases is Nero. Now, Luke knows what took place. And so do Luke's original readers. So if Luke were to write, Paul was released at that trial, he was declared not guilty and he was set free. And his readers would say, yeah, but 5 years later, the same Nero had him arrested and executed. So what's your point? So it could very well be that Luke knew what happened and Luke's readers knew what happened, and to say that Paul was released really wasn't much of a point, because in 5 years he will be executed by the same man who released him the first time. So that's probably a pretty good reason not to include it. Luke wanted to end Acts on a very positive note, and he does. He talks about the fact that the gospel spread unhindered during that time. But to include Paul's release, you would then have to mention his execution, and that means the book ends on a very negative note. And Luke doesn't want to do that. So that's at least one theory that makes sense, I think, as to why Luke doesn't record what happens at the trial. So assuming that Paul is set free, what did he do? Where did he go? One possible place he went was Spain. Once Paul was released, chances are he went on some additional missionary journeys, and we're going to look at that next. And one of the places he probably went was Spain. According to tradition, Paul did go to Spain. However, there's absolutely no evidence of it in the New Testament. Paul never writes that I went to Spain. Now, in order for Paul to have made that statement, there are only 3 books in which he could have made that statement. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Those are the 3 books he most likely wrote after his release from prison. But at that time, he was dealing with Titus, who was at Crete, trying to help him out. And the book of Titus is all about what's going on in Crete and how Paul can help Titus minister to those people. And then 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy are written to Timothy, and Timothy is in Ephesus, and the church in Ephesus is in a very bad position when Paul writes 1 Timothy. So at that point, why mention that he went to Spain? Another reason maybe that Paul doesn't mention it is the fact he went there and it didn't go well. There's a good possibility he went to Spain and things did not turn out the way he wanted, so why mention it? If things had gone really well, there might have been an opportunity for Paul to write a letter back to that church, but there's no evidence that he ever did. So why do people think that Paul went to Spain? One reason is Paul had indicated to the church at Rome that he wanted to go to Spain. In Romans 15, verse 24, written about AD 57, probably 2 to 3 years before Paul gets arrested in Jerusalem, Paul writes, "I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to see you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there after I have enjoyed your company for a while." So Paul, as a free person at this point, he's not been arrested, says to the church at Rome, "I have a dream of going to Spain. And by the way, on my way, I'm going to stop and visit with you. And while I'm visiting, how about if you assist me on my journey there?" In other words, take up a love offering, so that I can have some funds as I go to Spain, because I really want to go to Spain. He then says in verse 28, "So after I have completed this task and have made sure that they have received this contribution, I will go to Spain and visit you on the way." So many people think that Paul went to Spain because that was part of his plan. He absolutely planned to go there. But that's the only biblical evidence we have that Paul wanted to go or did go to Spain. However, Clement of Rome, writing in about AD 95, he wrote a letter to the church at Corinth, and he was talking about the Apostle Paul. And this is what he writes about Paul. "After preaching both in the East and the West, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and came to the extreme limit of the West, and suffered martyrdom under the prefects." That phrase, the extreme limit of the West, to a first century Roman would equal Spain. So according to Clement of Rome, he at least hints at the fact that Paul's ministry was not only east of Rome, but also west of Rome, and that would include Spain. There's one other evidence, and this is from what's called the Muratorian Canon. And the word canon means a list of scriptures that were recognized by the first century church. And this was compiled in about AD 180. And there was a list of books that were recognized by the church at that time as being Holy Scripture. They were beginning to put together what we now call the New Testament. And this is what's written about the book of Acts. "For most excellent Theophilus," and that's who Luke was writing to, "Luke compiled the individual events that took place in his presence, as he plainly shows by omitting the martyrdom of Peter, as well as the departure of Paul from the city of Rome when he journeyed to Spain." So according to this list, and according to those who compiled it, Luke wrote about what he knew, but he leaves out the fact that Peter was martyred, and Paul left Rome and ended up going to Spain. So did Paul go to Spain? We may never know. But according to the evidence, it looks like he did. But we have no evidence whatsoever of what happened when he got there. Only these very sketchy pieces of evidence. Well, that brings us to the fourth question. Did Paul make a fourth missionary journey after his release? We've talked about the 3 missionary journeys of Paul, and we traced those on the map, and we looked at exactly where he went. But after leaving Rome, did he make a fourth journey. And the common tradition is, once he left Rome, he did go to Spain, stayed there a while, but then he comes back east. And there are pieces of evidence in the books of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus that give us at least a hint of what Paul might have done on what we could call his fourth missionary journey. And perhaps after going to Spain and coming back east, there's a chance that Paul ended up on the island of Crete. And on the island of Crete was Titus, and Titus was ministering on that island. And Titus chapter 1, verse 5 says, "The reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order what was left unfinished, and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." So it looks like Paul ended up on Crete with Titus for a while, and they were spreading the gospel there. Chances are the gospel was already evident in Crete at that time, but perhaps they started additional churches in Crete. And Paul eventually leaves, but he tells Titus, you need to stay in Crete, and you need to appoint elders for each of those house churches that have now started. So apparently they went from town to town in the island of Crete and started house churches, and now they need elders. So Paul probably ended up in Crete on what we could call his fourth missionary journey. After leaving Crete, there's a possibility that Paul went to Ephesus. And at Ephesus, we find Timothy. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, "As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus." So Paul's saying, I was with you, then I went into Macedonia, I left, but I wanted you to stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer. At this point, Ephesus, the church at Ephesus, is an absolute mess because false doctrines are being taught. And who's teaching the false doctrines? Some of the elders in the church. And in fact, when we studied 1 Timothy on a Wednesday night a long time ago, several years ago, I basically made the comment that this assignment might be over Timothy's head. This was a very, very difficult assignment for young Timothy to pull off. But Paul stays there for a while, and he mentions the fact that when he was there, he had problems. There were some issues that came up, and there were some people who absolutely opposed him. So Paul leaves, and he goes to Macedonia, probably in the area of Philippi. But before he goes there, he decides to stop off in Miletus. And that brings us to 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 20. "Erastus stayed in Corinth, and I left Trophimus sick in Miletus." So apparently, Paul and Trophimus are on this journey together. They come to Miletus, they minister there. Trophimus gets sick there, and he can't travel anymore. So what does Paul do? He just leaves him there, certainly in the company of the church there. And Paul goes on to Macedonia, but he leaves Trophimus sick in Miletus. From that point, Paul's going to continue to travel north into Macedonia. And chances are he took a boat to get there. And that boat would have gone through Troas. So he says to Timothy sometime later, when you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, and my scrolls, especially the parchments. So apparently on his way to Macedonia, Paul stops off in Troas, and he gives his winter coat, basically, his cloak, and some of his writing materials to a man named Carpus, certainly intending to go back after them at a reasonable time. And then Paul moves on towards Macedonia. He then says to Titus, "As soon as I send Artemas or Tychicus to you, do your best to come to me at Nicopolis, because I have decided to winter there. So Paul decides that in the city of Nicopolis, that's where he's going to spend the winter. And he wants Titus to come and visit him. So he's going to send either Artemas or Tychicus to take his place. And it's interesting as we read this, Paul was in the process of deciding what to do. He really wasn't sure what to do, which of the two men to send. But he's going to send one of them to Crete, and Titus is supposed to leave Crete and come to Nicopolis and spend the winter with Paul. In your notes, I listed several places that Paul may have visited during this fourth missionary journey. Those included Crete, Corinth, Miletus, Philippi, Colossae, Troas, Ephesus, and Nicopolis. It's quite possible that during this time, when he goes to Corinth, that's when Paul writes the two letters, the letter that we call Titus and the letter we call 1 Timothy. And again, both of those individuals were trying to lead a church that had some issues, and Paul was addressing those issues. And it's interesting, in both of those books, appointing elders with the right qualifications were big issues in both of those churches. And Paul gives us a lot of qualities that an elder, a church leader, should have in those books. It's also quite possible that while Paul is in Nicopolis, that's when he gets arrested a second time. We're going to look at his chronology next, but in AD 64, that was the Great Fire of Rome, that just about every scholar agrees that Nero set the fire. But Nero wasn't going to take blame for it, so he needed a scapegoat, and he chose the Christians as the scapegoat. And thus began a horrible, really horrible persecution of Christians. And they went after the Apostle Paul. And it's quite possible they found him in Nicopolis, arrested him, and took him to Rome. Paul mentions the fact that he wants his cloak. He left it in Troas. If it's wintertime, Paul would then be taken to Rome. And the first time Paul was taken to Rome, he got to live under house arrest because he wasn't guilty of anything at the time. Now that he's been arrested by Rome, he doesn't get to live in his own house. He's placed in a prison. And most call that the Mamertine prison, which was just absolutely horrible conditions. And Paul needed his coat, his winter coat, because it was wintertime. While Paul is there, he's visited by Onesiphorus. He's abandoned by a lot of his Christian friends. Paul's been arrested, and chances are they know he's going to be executed. So the last thing I want to do is be associated with him, so everybody splits. Paul says that Demas has deserted him. But somehow, Paul finds a way to write his very last letter. It's the letter we call 2 Timothy. And in that letter, Paul makes it very clear that his days are short. In chapter 4 of 2 Timothy, Paul says, I'm already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time has come for my departure. He goes on to say, I have fought a good fight, I have finished my race, and I have kept the faith. And the Lord has a crown of righteousness, which he will give to me on that day, the day of his second coming. So Paul kind of concludes the book realizing my days are numbered, my days are short. I do want to share this verse with you. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. Paul probably has days or maybe weeks left on earth. Only Luke is with me. I think that says a lot about the relationship between Paul and Luke. Remember, Luke was with Paul during that shipwreck and that 14-day storm, and Luke spent a lot of time with Paul. Luke and Paul were buddies, Christian buddies. They were friends. They were close. And there's no way that Luke is going to abandon Paul. He's going to stay with him right to the very end. He was a great friend. I think another reason Luke didn't want to write in Acts chapter 28 about Paul's execution, it would have been very painful to write about the execution of one of your closest friends, someone you'd spent years with, doing ministry with. And Luke decided to just leave that part out. It may have been too painful to even mention. What eventually happens to Paul? We go back to Eusebius, the church historian, and he writes, "It is therefore recorded that Paul was beheaded in Rome itself, and that Peter likewise was crucified under Nero." When the Apostle John talks about the Antichrist in the book of Revelation, his model for the Antichrist, Nero. Nero had Paul executed and Peter executed too. I mean, how would you like to stand before God after doing that? No wonder John used him as the model of what an antichrist would do. So Paul's life ends in martyrdom. And that was about AD 66 to 68. But I want to wrap things up with a chronology of Paul's life, beginning with Acts chapter 21. That's when he gets arrested. And so somewhere between AD 57 and 59, Paul is arrested in Jerusalem after the fiasco in the temple area. And then he's soon sent to Caesarea because it looked like if Paul was going to stay in Jerusalem, he wasn't going to stay alive. So the Roman centurion decided Paul needs to leave town. And in the middle of the night, he sent him with a lot of Roman troops to Caesarea. And Paul stays there for 2 years. Felix was the governor. And on his way out, Felix should have released Paul, but he didn't. So Festus becomes the governor, and he should have released Paul too, but he didn't. And eventually, the only way Paul gets out of Caesarea is to appeal to Caesar. And so AD 59 is that journey to Rome, that incredible sea voyage that we talked about, when Paul goes from Caesarea to Rome, gets lost at sea for 14 days, and eventually, after a period of time, ends up in Rome. AD 60 to 62 is Paul's first imprisonment, and we talked about that in Acts chapter 28, verses 17 through 31. Luke indicates that Paul was there 2 years proclaiming the gospel. During this time, Paul writes the books of Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. I quoted what Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 4, that the time has come for my departure. When you read the book of Philippians, Paul's thinking, is it time for me to go and be with Christ, or is it time for me to stay here? And Paul battles that back and forth because at that point he has no idea how the trial's going to turn out. But at the end, he's very positive in the book of Philippians. Like, I'm pretty sure I'm getting out. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be declared innocent and I'm going to be free. But in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he's just as positive that he's not getting out, that the time has come for his departure. So very different vibes that we get from the book of Philippians and 2 Timothy. In AD 63, Paul is released from prison. He makes further travels, and then he writes Titus and 1 Timothy to try to help out those young colleagues that he has going through some tough times leading churches. AD 64 was the Great Fire of Rome, and that's when Nero's persecution took place. And that changed everything. Luke indicates at the end of Acts chapter 28 that the gospel is, spreading unhindered? Well, that ended in AD 64 with the persecution. AD 66 to 68, that's Paul's second imprisonment in Rome and eventually his death. And he writes 2 Timothy shortly before his death. During those same years, AD 66 to 70, that's Israel's war with Rome. A lot of political unrest in the nation of Israel. They were still looking for a Messiah. They'd already rejected Jesus as their Messiah. They were still looking for a Messiah who would come and form an army, defeat the Romans, and get the Gentiles out of town. That's what they were looking for. What they didn't realize or failed to realize is that Rome was very powerful at this time. If they had waited a while, they could have possibly defeated the Romans, but not during those years. And then finally in AD 70, that's when Jerusalem gets destroyed. Paul never lives long enough to see that. In fact, maybe the only apostle who lives long enough to have lived through that would be the apostle John. But he wasn't in Jerusalem, he was in Ephesus. He escaped because of what Jesus' prophecies were. When you hear certain things and certain rumors, get out of town, and a lot of Christians did, and they were spared from the destruction of AD 70. And then somewhere between 70 and 80, Luke writes his gospel, and he also writes the book of Acts. So that's a chronology. That's a look at what most likely happened to the Apostle Paul. So as we wrap things up tonight, I want to give you an opportunity, if you have any questions, maybe about what we looked at tonight, or maybe another question that's been hanging over your head. As we've gone through these chapters in the book of Acts, this is your opportunity to ask anything you'd like to ask.
Pastor, it amazes me about John, that he was the last one of the Gospels to write, and just the way he started in it just blows you away.
Yes. Yeah, it's amazing to me that John wrote the Gospel of John, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, and the book of Revelation, about 30 years after Paul was dead. Yeah, the last one alive. And he saw a lot of changes during those years. And that's one of the reasons why when John writes, he's writing to basically the universal church, because there is no Jerusalem anymore. He's not dealing with a temple anymore, because the temple was destroyed in AD 70. So no wonder he says, "For God so loved the world, and whoever is willing may come." At that point, the gospel had spread not just to Jewish people, but a lot of Gentile people as well. And John was welcoming everyone into faith in Christ at that time. So it looked a whole lot different for John in 95 than it did for Paul in the 60s. So, yes, great question. Anyone else? Yes, Judy?
Maybe I had my head in the paper instead of listening to you, but I didn't catch the part of the places he visited or we think he visited. You say Colossae, only the 22 verse, I didn't catch the reference to Colossae.
Yeah, Paul had basically said to Philemon that save a room for me because I'll come and visit you. Yes. Yeah. Colossae and Philemon go hand in hand there. Yeah, so basically, even Paul at that time, his trial had not taken place, but he said to Philemon, save a room for me. And that's one of the reasons why, at this point, Paul's thinking, I am getting out. I'm not going to be executed in AD 62. So, yes. Any other questions? Yes, Ernie?
Luke was a medical doctor, and he took care of Paul. Yes. Because Paul had some kind of medical problem,
Right.
Thing with the leg, and he had many episodes of that malaria, and that's why they were such close friends, because he was Paul's doctor.
Yes, and that may have been his role as well, being Paul's personal physician through all of this. And yeah, that thorn in the flesh, most scholars think it has something to do with Paul's eyesight, and malaria or some other kind of disease could have brought that on. It's interesting in reading Luke's writings and talking about medicine and doctors back in the first century. They didn't do a lot back in the first century. I mean, it's not like today where, we hold doctors in pretty high esteem because of what they're able to do. They've been through medical school. That in itself, you should get a gold star for that, just going through all of those very difficult classes. And doctors today can do some incredible things. Back in the first century, not so much. I mean, they could do some things, but not as much. And even though Luke is referred to as a physician, I think he was a greater historian and writer than he was a physician. I think that was really his gift and calling, to be able to write and to record this history that we now enjoy in the book of Acts. Probably more so than he was skilled at being a physician. Because back in the first century, a lot of physicians were slaves. They were owned by somebody, and then they became their personal physician because of that. And I'm not sure exactly who Theophilus was, but Luke may have been his doctor at one point too, and that's why he was writing to him. So, not quite sure, but I think Luke's greatest quality was his writing ability and his ability to do research. And he was not there with Jesus, but he wrote an incredible gospel because he did such great research. And the same thing with what he wrote about Paul. Any other questions? All righty. Well, we're going to wrap things up tonight, and next week we will look at the book of Hebrews, and we'll try to answer all those questions. And by the way, your homework is, between now and then, try to figure out who wrote Hebrews. It is, it's basically been one of those mysteries for the past 2,000 years. So just figure it out between now and next week. So see what you can do with that one. Well, let me close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for how you used the life of the Apostle Paul way back in the first century to bring the gospel to Gentiles and to all people. Father, we're so thankful because if it wasn't for those who went before us, we may not have had an opportunity to hear that message today. Thank you for those who were faithful to you in generations past, in centuries past. And Father, may we learn from them to be faithful to you today in our generation, doing all we can today, just like they did then, to proclaim the message of Christ to as many people as possible. So, Father, give us opportunities to proclaim your message and to announce the good news of salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. I pray in his name, amen.